in purgatory, the finished work of Jesus Christ. Now, the issue, 4 minutes, the canon. Seems like this is a trump card again. Unfortunately, everything I said about this subject in the book was, I guess, not looked at, not dealt with, not responded to. I differentiated in my book, this is in the Roman Catholic controversy, and by the way, you were wrong about the page that Basil was cited on. It's page 35 of the book on Sola Scriptura. And in fact, I cited everything that he read plus more context than what he read. And yet he says I'm taking it out of context. I invite you to just look. Just look. But I dealt with the issue of the canon extensively. I pointed out that the canon is determined and decided by one person, God. Why? Because the canon is simply the list of what God inspired and what he doesn't. God ultimately, and Roman Catholic theologians agree with this, God ultimately is the author of canon. The canon does not exist separately from Scripture. It is a function of the work of the inspiration of the Scripture. The issue we have to deal with here is, how do we know, how do we gain knowledge of what the canon is? And Mr. Staples may stand up here and say, I have infallible knowledge of what the canon is. Well, when did you get that infallible knowledge, Mr. Staples? The New Catholic Encyclopedia admits that the first dogmatic and infallible definition of what the canon is in its fullness took place about 450 years ago. What did anybody do before then? 1,500 years, no one could live a proper Christian life because they didn't have an infallible revelation of the canon? Of course not. Pope Gregory the Great didn't even agree with the canon the Council of Trent came up with. Cardinal Cajetan, Thomas of Vio at the time of the Reformation, laughed at those who believed that the deuterocanonical books were canonical. So what do we have here? Well, Mr. Staples has just proven my original assertion right again. Why does Mr. Staples have infallible certainty about the canon? It's not because he's read Athanasius or Jerome or gone into tradition or gone into Scripture. Sola Ecclesia. There it is again, ultimate authority. I have infallible certainty. How did, Mr. Staples, and you know I'm going to ask you this question because you've listened to the debate, how did the godly man who lived in Palestine 50 years before Christ know that Isaiah or 2 Chronicles are Scripture? You know that's the question that I ask. I'd like to see what you say. Did he have an infallible revelation? I can't believe you're going to say that, because the canon that they held to there in Palestine was different than yours, so it couldn't have been infallible. Well, did he not have an infallible revelation? Then how could Jesus hold men responsible for what Scripture says? He did, Matthew chapter 22. Well, wait a minute. If Jesus can hold men accountable for what Scripture says without some infallible magisterium to tell them what Scripture is, then why can't I, as a Protestant, have a sufficient knowledge of the canon without an infallible magisterium? Why can't I do that? I can. Simple fact of the matter is, when Mr. Staples talks to us about this infallible tradition, it's not infallible. That tradition to which he holds has made many an error. It's contradicted itself and has now defined as dogmatic beliefs binding upon the Christian conscience doctrines utterly unknown in the Bible and unknown in the early church. And I could stand up here and talk about all the challenges that I've made to Mr. Staples that I haven't heard a word of response on, like he talked about my not responding. We don't have time to get to everything up here. There's going to be some things he's going to say I'm not going to be able to get to. There's going to be some things vice versa. That's the way of debates. But on this issue, I think Mr. Staples needs to step up to the bat. Does Mr. Staples believe in the bodily assumption of Mary? That's my first question. Does he believe it's an apostolic doctrine? Secondly, and would he please trace it for us and demonstrate that his understanding of 2 Thessalonians 2:15 is in fact correct? I think it's a fair request. Thank you very much.
First of all, my opponent asked me the question, how did the man of God know what Scripture was 50 years before Christ? He knew it by adhering to the tradition of the church. As I demonstrated to you, the tradition of, now when I say church, I'm speaking of the Old Testament in the sense that the book of Acts does as the church or the ecclesia, the called out ones in the wilderness. But the fact is, The Old Testament church, so to speak, did not, it is true, did not have a council or an infallible statement from the high priest. They did not have a council where they concluded what the canon was. And I find that fascinating. In that, yes, even though they didn't, in fact, I have here a list of a number of different canons that the Jews relied on. If you're Alexandrian or Ethiopian Jew, you had the Septuagint, or what we would call today the Septuagint, which contained both the Proto and Deuterocanonical books. If you were an Essene, you had the Pentateuch, you had much of what we have, minus the book of Esther, and you had some of the Deuterocanonicals. If you were a Pharisee, you had the Palestinian canon. If you were a Hellenistic Jew of the dispersion, you had the Septuagint. If you were a Sadducee, you accepted the Pentateuch only. So yes, they were divided on this issue at the time of Christ. That's a fact. But you see, that does not change the fact that the Old Testament man of God is still bound to the authority that God established in the Old Testament. You see, my opponent cannot answer the question, so he is making a clever debate trick here and trying to shift the burden of proof onto me. But of course, that's not what this debate is about. He is supposed to demonstrate to me that the Scripture alone is a sole rule of faith. And when I ask him to give me Scripture, he's the one who believes it, not me. Sola Scriptura. The Scripture alone is the sole rule of the faith. Well, if that's true, then we ought to see why we accept the canon of Scripture in the Scripture. In fact, whenever Mr. White goes, I want you to notice, whenever Mr. White goes to prove why he accepts this or that canon, what does he do? He goes to the tradition of the church. He just doesn't want to admit that. You know, he's more Catholic than he knows. Second point is, I did not call Mr. White a Jehovah's Witness. But I think he did fail to see the point that I was making in demonstrating, and I know we toss around these numbers a lot in debates, but it is true, the 23,000 churches, the 26,000 churches. But I believe my question is a valid one. He's already demonstrated that he can't give me an infallible reason. He can't give me an authoritative reason why he can accept Scripture as the inspired, infallible rule of faith. Listen, folks, if you don't have an infallible source to understand what the Scripture is, then how can you say, as St. Thomas Aquinas once wrote, that you even have the habit of faith? Because faith must be rooted in an infallible source. Now, Mr. White, I accept your challenge to debate infallibility. I accept your